I felt the rocket shaking, but the engines weren't even on yet. There was a strange silence in the capsule. Not the usual calm before launch, this was different. We were strapped in, fully suited, Soyuz systems humming around us. Gennady was on my right, eyes darting across his instruments. I could see a bead of sweat rolling along the inside of his helmet. Then I felt it. A faint vibration. At first, it felt like someone bumping the tower. Then stronger, the entire launch structure groaning like it was about to collapse. Gennady leaned toward the console. "Vladimir, do you smell that? Burning. Like scorched plastic and hot oil." I looked out the tiny porthole. Couldn't see flames, just movement. The swing arms of the gantry were trembling, not retracting. Something was wrong on the pad, badly wrong, and we still hadn't lifted off. No word from ground control. That silence hit harder than any explosion. "Control, this is T-10-1, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're detecting vibration and possible smoke. Confirm status." No reply. Just static. Then, finally, "There is a fire. At the base of the booster." My throat went dry. Fire. Beneath 270 tons of fuel. Beneath us. I looked at Gennady. He didn't say a word, just locked eyes with me. We both knew. If the fire reached the tanks before the escape system fired, we'd be vapor. I reached for the manual abort switch. My gloved hand hovered over the cover. We weren't supposed to trigger it ourselves unless we lost all contact. But the fire was seconds away from turning us into a crater. "Control," I said, "activate the escape system." Still nothing. Gennady snapped, "They need to fire it now. We don't have." Then everything happened at once. The booster groaned. The capsule jolted. And something deep inside the rocket made a sound I'll never forget, a pressure surge, a metallic howl, like the entire stack was tearing apart. I yelled, "Now!" There was no warning. Just a jolt so violent it knocked the breath out of me. 1 second I was screaming into the mic for ground control to activate the escape system, and the next we were moving, ripping, away from the booster like a bullet out of a gun. The tower and the rocket vanished below in a blur of smoke and flame. My entire body was pressed back into the seat as if someone was holding me down with a truck. It was the SAS, the launch escape system, and it had finally fired. We didn't know this at the time, but the system had triggered just seconds before the entire launch pad exploded. There was no visual, no countdown, no protocol. Just a brute force detachment of our capsule from the inferno below. The escape tower's solid fuel motors burned at full thrust, dragging us away at nearly 14 to 17 gs. It felt like my ribs were being crushed into my spine. I couldn't lift my arms, couldn't even finish a sentence. Gennady was next to me, gritting his teeth, white-knuckled on the armrest. We were both trying to stay conscious. There wasn't time to think. I wasn't scared in the way I thought I'd be. There was no room for fear, only sensation, heat, noise, pressure. The noise inside the capsule was overwhelming. A deep, grinding roar from the escape motors mixed with creaks and bangs from the structural stress. I could hear the skin of the capsule groaning. The Soyuz wasn't designed to be handled like this. It was a controlled emergency, but just barely. For all we knew, the fire had cooked some part of the rocket that would fail mid-ascent. It wasn't over yet. Then came the separation. A hard clunk, a sharp jolt. The escape tower had burned out and detached, and our descent module was now falling back toward Earth, arcing slightly to land far from the burning pad. We were tumbling slightly, but the systems kicked in, stabilizers, chutes, each with their own sequence and timing. It was too fast and chaotic to follow in real time, but I remember noting, with something like detached relief, that the drogue chute deployed. We were still alive, and the systems hadn't failed. Yet. The main parachute deployed with a force that slammed us forward in the straps. I felt my helmet knock slightly against the seat. Not hard enough to injure, but enough to remind me that we were still in the middle of a very rough ride. Below us, the Kazakh steppe was rising rapidly. I looked out the porthole again, this time seeing nothing but dust and terrain. It wasn't a planned landing zone, just open land, cold and dry, with a few scattered shrubs. It was going to be a hard landing. Gennady glanced over. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. Brace for impact. We both reached for the handles to prepare for touchdown. Then came the final jolt, the retro-rockets firing just a split second before we hit the ground. Not enough to make it soft, but enough to stop us from being shattered. We hit hard, a sharp impact that sent a shock through my spine and shoulders. My helmet bounced against the headrest, and I felt the weight of my body slam against the harness. Then silence. No fire. No secondary explosion. Just silence. The air inside the capsule felt hot and metallic. I could still smell the remnants of burning insulation, and my mouth was dry from breathing pure oxygen for hours. We sat there for a moment, just breathing. The capsule creaked slightly as it settled in the dirt. I looked at Gennady. He looked back at me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. We were alive, but we didn't fully believe it yet. Then I started laughing. I don't know why. Maybe shock. Maybe relief. Maybe because I realized we'd been one button press away from dying in the most explosive way possible. Gennady shook his head, managed a crooked smile, and said, "Well, that was one way to cancel a launch." The recovery team arrived quickly, but not instantly. We waited inside the capsule while they homed in on our signal. I used the time to run a quick check on our suits, then on the displays. The capsule had held up surprisingly well. No breaches. No critical damage. But I kept thinking about what could have happened if the escape system had fired just 5 seconds later. The fire had already started climbing the side of the rocket when we lifted off. We didn't even know it at the time, but the ground crew had only just barely sent the manual abort command. The automatic systems had failed. It had to be triggered by a human, a decision made in the final seconds. Eventually, we heard voices outside. The hatch was unsealed, and cold air rushed in. Kazakh dust blew in with it, stinging my nose. A technician reached down, grabbed my hand, and pulled me out. My legs were unsteady, but I was upright. As I stepped away from the capsule, I turned back to look at it, a scorched, dust-covered orb lying sideways in the dirt. And beyond it, smoke still rising from the launch pad on the horizon. Someone handed me a flask of water. I took a sip and didn't say anything. What was there to say? We'd trained for spaceflight. Instead, we'd been through an explosion. They drove us back to the Baikonur Cosmodrome in silence. No radio chatter, no congratulations, no laughter. Just the rumble of the truck across the rough steppe and the occasional creak of the frame. I sat with my helmet on my lap, staring out the window at the horizon, trying to process what had just happened. Gennady was next to me, rubbing the red marks on his neck where the straps had bitten into his skin. His face looked stiff, as if he was holding something in. I didn't say anything, because I didn't know what to say. I felt like my body had gone through a car crash and my brain was still catching up. There were no heroic feelings. No sense of triumph. Just this persistent, gnawing thought, we should have died. If the tower operator had hesitated by a few more seconds, we wouldn't be here. The medical staff checked us out first. Blood pressure, oxygen levels, reflexes. I remember the doctor muttering something about elevated stress indicators and minor contusions, but I wasn't really listening. My ears were still ringing. The adrenaline had left my system by then, and all that was left was fatigue. I didn't feel brave. I felt lucky. And a little ashamed that I felt lucky, because the launch pad crew hadn't been so fortunate. We later found out that several ground personnel had been burned trying to control the fire. One of them spent weeks in a hospital recovering. The rest had to watch the entire structure erupt just seconds after our capsule was pulled free. They had seen the whole thing, the way the flames licked up the side of the booster, the way the tank ruptured. We'd been sitting inside the top of a time bomb, waiting for someone to hit the eject button. They had to stand there and hope they weren't standing too close when it went off. The official debrief started that same night. We were taken to a room deep inside one of the administrative buildings, the kind with beige walls and wooden desks and old, humming air conditioners. There were 5 people waiting for us, flight controllers, military officials, someone from Energia, and a quiet man with a ministry badge who didn't say anything at all, just took notes. They asked us to go through the sequence second by second. What did we see? What did we hear? Did the control panel light up? Did we smell anything before the vibration started? How long between the smell and the escape system? We answered every question as best we could, but it was clear they were more interested in what we didn't do. Had we tried to override any systems? Did we attempt to trigger the abort manually? Had we interfered in the process at all? It was subtle, but I could tell they were probing for a mistake, not out of malice, just out of habit. That was how the system worked. If something failed, someone had to be blamed. At one point, Gennady leaned forward and said, "We were seconds from being killed. The escape system should have fired automatically. Why didn't it?" The room went quiet for a moment. One of the engineers cleared his throat and said, "There was a delay in the ground signal. Manual override was activated at the pad." That was all he said. Later we found out the real story. The automatic system had been disabled during pre-launch because of a test configuration. The ground crew had to send the abort command manually. And the man who did it, a launch controller named Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Titov, had waited until the flames were already visible. He triggered the escape system with barely 5 seconds to spare. 5 seconds between life and a crater. After the debrief, we were told to stay out of the press. No interviews, no public appearances. The incident hadn't been officially acknowledged yet, and wouldn't be for years. The Soviet Union didn't advertise failed launches, especially not ones where the vehicle exploded on the pad. We were told we had been successfully recovered, and that the incident was classified as a technical anomaly. I didn't care about the wording, but I remember thinking it felt surreal. We had nearly been killed in the most violent way possible, and now we were expected to go back to work like nothing happened. The next day, they sent us to the simulator. Same seats, same straps, same procedures. As if the last 24 hours had been a drill. That night, Gennady and I shared a quiet meal in the cosmonaut quarters. I wasn't hungry, but I forced myself to eat. Bread, soup, some dried fruit. The room was warm, and the lights were dim. I remember looking at the wallpaper and thinking how absurd it was that something so domestic could exist in a place where people prepared to be launched into orbit. Gennady set down his fork and said, "I dreamed we went up. That the rocket didn't explode. That we made it to Salyut." I looked at him, unsure what to say. Then he added, "And when I woke up, I was disappointed." That surprised me. "Disappointed?" I asked. "You wanted to be up there?" He nodded. "We trained for years. And in one night, it all vanished. Now what? We wait for another shot." That was the hardest part. Not the escape, not the explosion, the waiting. Knowing that your mission is gone, but you're still alive, still healthy, still ready, and yet stuck in limbo. We weren't rookies anymore. We were the crew of a failed launch, even though the failure hadn't been ours. And that label stuck, whether people said it or not. The next assignment wouldn't come quickly, and we both knew it. We had seen the fragility of the system, how close everything runs to disaster, and that knowledge changed us. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, lasting ways. A stiffness in the posture. A longer pause before replying. A new awareness of how thin the line is between a mission and a memorial. The weeks that followed were the slowest I had ever experienced. We weren't grounded officially, but it felt like we had been pushed aside. There was no schedule, no new mission plan, no discussion of a ref light. Just endless medical evaluations, technical briefings, and bureaucratic silence. I would show up every morning at the training center, put on my flight suit, and sit in the same simulator we had used 100 times before. Except now it wasn't preparation, it was maintenance. They had to keep our skills sharp, they said, in case we were reassigned. But no one told us when that would be, or if it would ever happen. Every day felt like a loop: arrive, review checklists, run simulations, debrief, go home. The engineers didn't look us in the eye anymore. Not out of disrespect, but because we reminded them of something that wasn't supposed to happen. I spent a lot of time in the centrifuge again. It wasn't mandatory, but I asked to go. I needed to feel that acceleration again, that force pushing down on me, just to prove that my body still remembered how to fly. But even the centrifuge felt different now. Not because of the machine itself, but because I knew what the real thing felt like, being hurled away from a rocket as it disintegrated beneath you. The instructors would ask how it compared, and I would tell them, it's close, but not violent enough. They thought I was joking, but I wasn't. Gennady and I didn't talk much about the incident after the first few days. There was nothing left to say. We had both been through it, and we both knew what had almost happened. That kind of shared experience doesn't require repetition. We did talk about the station, though. Sally at 7 was still up there, waiting. Another crew had launched weeks after us, Soyuz T-10, the replacement mission. Different number, same destination. Watching them go up was strange. I sat in the viewing room at the control center, watching the launch on the screen. It felt like watching someone else take your seat in a plane you had missed. I wanted to be happy for them, but it just made the waiting worse. One afternoon, during a routine check-in with the head of the training division, I asked directly, "Are we flying again or not?" He paused, looked down at the file on his desk, and said, "We haven't made that decision yet." That was the answer I had expected, but hearing it out loud still hit hard. I thanked him and left the room. Later that day, I got a call from a former commander who had flown 3 missions in the 70s. He told me, "You survived something no cosmonaut ever had to before. That makes them nervous. They don't know what to do with you now." I asked what he meant, and he said, "In their minds, a launch abort isn't a success, it's a failure that didn't kill you." That's not the same thing. I hung up the phone and sat alone in the office for a long time. I started having dreams about the launch. Not nightmares, just vivid replays of the moment we separated from the booster. In the dreams, everything was slower. I could hear every sound, feel every vibration. The pressure on my chest, the shaking of the harness, the instant drop in weight when the escape tower jettisoned. Sometimes the dream ended with us landing safely, other times with the capsule engulfed in flame. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my jaw sore from clenching. Gennady said he had similar dreams. We didn't dwell on it. We just acknowledged it and moved on. After 2 months, we were summoned to Moscow for a review meeting with the State Commission. It was mostly procedural. They went over the timeline, the equipment logs, the escape sequence. They praised the ground crew for triggering the manual abort in time. We nodded and thanked them. There was a short discussion about the fault in the booster's valve system that had led to the leak and subsequent fire. They explained how it had been a design flaw combined with a rare sequencing error. I remember one engineer saying, "It was not expected under normal conditions," as if that explained everything. Then they moved on to future vehicle modifications. Not once did anyone mention psychological effects, or whether we felt prepared to fly again. That wasn't their concern. Back at the training center, things started to shift. Slowly. The tone changed. Instead of avoiding the subject, people began referring to us as the T-10-1 crew with a kind of respect. The instructors started including us in mission planning discussions again. A new flight schedule was being assembled, and we were quietly added to the list of potential crews. It wasn't official, but it was a signal. I didn't get my hopes up, not yet, but I allowed myself to think about it. Flying again, completing what we had started. Not for pride, but for closure. I received a letter from my father during that time. He didn't say much, just that he was proud I had stayed calm under pressure, and that our family name would be remembered not because I had flown, but because I had come back. It struck me how different his view was from mine. To him, survival was the achievement. To me, it was just unfinished work. One evening, months later, Gennady and I sat in the mess hall after a long simulator run. He looked across the table and said, "If they gave you a flight tomorrow, would you take it?" I said yes without hesitation. He nodded and said, "Me too. I don't want to be the cosmonaut who almost went to space." The official reassignment came without ceremony. No handshake, no announcement, just a folded document handed to me by a quiet administrator in a gray hallway. Inside, a formal note from the head of the State Commission confirmed that Gennady and I had been approved as the primary crew for Soyuz T-8. I read it twice, slowly, making sure I understood every word. It was almost a year since the launch abort. 12 months of training, waiting, speculation, and now we were going back. When I told Gennady, he didn't smile or cheer, he just nodded once and said, "About time." That was his way of processing it. For me, it was more complicated. I felt relief, pride, and something else I couldn't name. Maybe anxiety. Maybe the weight of everything that had come before. The training changed after that. The tone shifted. We were no longer anomalies, they treated us like working professionals again. We returned to full-time flight prep. Long simulator hours, orbital rendezvous drills, failure scenarios, EVA planning. It was physically exhausting and mentally heavier than before, because now we knew exactly what could go wrong, and not in theory. We didn't skip a single system review. We double-checked every checklist. Every small inconsistency was a discussion. Every malfunction simulation was taken seriously. I could tell the instructors were watching us closely, looking for signs that the previous mission had left scars. But we performed cleanly, and we knew the systems better than most. As the launch date approached, I found myself going over the last minutes of T-10-1 in my head constantly. I knew it wasn't rational, but I kept imagining the same scene, sitting on the pad, hearing nothing from the tower, watching the launch structure sway. I tried to push it away, but it lingered. Every time I stepped into the Soyuz simulator, I checked the abort handle without even thinking. I wanted to believe that the worst had already happened to us, that the odds were now in our favor. But I also knew there were no real guarantees. The same vehicle that could lift you into orbit could also kill you in 4 seconds. That never changed. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before launch, we met with the engineering team responsible for modifications to the launch escape system. They had added a new automatic override, improved sensor feedback from the pad, and adjusted the command logic for manual aborts. The improvements made sense. They were logical. But during the meeting, one of the engineers looked at me and asked, "Do you trust it?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the chart in front of me, then at the small plastic model of the Soyuz on the table, and finally I said, "I trust the people who pressed the button." That was the truth. Hardware could fail. It already had. But the person in the tower who had made the decision to abort, that man had given us a second chance. I still didn't know his name. Launch day came quickly. We went through the same routine as before: suit up, medical checks, drive to the pad, climb into the capsule. But this time, every step felt heavier. Familiar, but different. I felt it in my breathing, in the way my fingers moved through the pre-launch checklist. Gennady and I didn't talk much during the countdown. We had already said everything in the past year. The capsule felt exactly the same, cramped, noisy, functional. No luxury. Just a machine built to survive spaceflight and bring us back. Outside, the sun was rising over Baikonur, casting long shadows across the tower. I kept my eyes on the control panel, listening for the voice of the launch director. This time, the countdown continued smoothly. No smells, no shaking, no silence. At T-0, the engines ignited. The vibration was immediate and full body, like being strapped to a living engine. But it was expected. Controlled. I felt the pressure build under my seat as the boosters lifted us off the pad. There was no explosion, no emergency. Just upward motion, clean and constant. I remember gripping the armrest harder than I needed to, not because I was scared, but because I didn't fully believe we were leaving the ground safely until we cleared the tower. Only after the booster stages separated did I allow myself to exhale. Gennady turned to me slightly and said, "Now we're actually flying." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. We reached orbit without incident. The capsule entered a stable trajectory, and the systems ran nominally. But our problems weren't over. We were supposed to rendezvous with Sally at 7, perform docking maneuvers, and begin a multi-week mission. But during final approach, we encountered a guidance system failure. The radar malfunctioned. It was a critical issue, one that affected automated docking. The backup systems were not responding as expected. We tried switching modes, but the signal was unstable. The capsule was oscillating, and we couldn't risk a manual docking without proper velocity confirmation. We made several attempts, adjusting attitude and range, but it became clear that we couldn't safely connect. That moment, the realization that after all this effort we wouldn't complete the mission, hit harder than I expected. We had survived an explosion, waited a year, trained endlessly, launched cleanly, and now a radar failure would keep us from boarding the station. The frustration was immediate. I remember gripping the control stick and saying, "We have the fuel. Let us try it manually." But the guidance officer back on Earth was firm. "Negative. The risk is unacceptable. Abort docking sequence." I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. Any miscalculation would result in a collision, and that would be the end of the capsule, the mission, and probably us. We had no margin for error. So we backed off. Retreated to a safe orbit. A decision was made to return early. No station, no long-duration flight, just a few orbits and then back to Earth. It felt like failure, even though everything technically worked. The re-entry went smoothly. The capsule landed without issue. But inside, both of us were quiet. There was no celebration, no applause. Just a shared understanding that we had done everything we could, and it still hadn't been enough. After the Soyuz T-10 landing, there was no press conference. No speeches. No official acknowledgement of how much we had overcome to get there. The mission was short, incomplete, technically safe but ultimately disappointing. We had launched, reached orbit, attempted docking, and returned without damage. From an engineering perspective, it was acceptable. From a personal perspective, it felt like we had been handed another unfinished chapter. No one blamed us. The radar failure was real, and no one in mission control had questioned the decision to abort the docking. But that didn't make it easier to accept. When we stepped out of the capsule on the Kazakh steppe, blinking under the cold sky, I felt like we were right back where we started, on the ground, looking up, wondering what might have been. In the weeks that followed, the mood in Star City was subdued. We filed our reports, attended post-flight debriefings, submitted medical data, and sat through review panels that felt more like routine formality than genuine inquiry. No one asked us what it had felt like to be denied the chance to complete the mission. No one asked how it felt to come so close to redemption only to be pulled back again. I stopped expecting those questions. The space program wasn't built to explore feelings. It was built to produce results, and we hadn't delivered a station crew. We had returned safely, and for most people, that was enough. But safety had never been the goal. Completion was. Gennady and I continued training, but our names didn't appear on the next few flight manifests. We were rotated into backup positions, support roles, simulator operations. I tried not to read too much into it, but the reality was obvious. We weren't considered first line anymore. The program was cautious, and reputation mattered. 2 launches, 2 missions, and no time spent on the station. There were other cosmonauts waiting, younger ones, unmarked by failed rendezvous or abort sequences. I didn't blame them. That was how the system worked. But it made the days longer. In private, we spoke less and less about the earlier incident. The launch pad fire, the escape system, the explosion, those memories never left, but we learned not to carry them around all the time. Still, there were reminders. Whenever we passed the training mock-up, I found my eyes drifting to the abort handle. My hand would twitch slightly when the escape procedure came up in simulation. It never got in the way of performance, but it was there, always in the background. Not trauma, exactly. Just awareness. We had seen the failure state, not in theory, but in motion. We had lived inside it, and that changed how we read every checklist, how we ran every procedure. The young cosmonauts who asked us about it would sometimes laugh when we answered seriously. But they stopped laughing when they saw that we weren't exaggerating. In 1987, for years after the abort, I was told I had been selected again. This time it was real, primary crew for Soyuz T-10-1, a long-duration mission to Mir. Gennady was not part of this flight. My new crewmates were Musa Manarov and Anatoly Levchenko. The feeling was different now. I was older, more measured. There was no burst of excitement, no triumphant moment. Just a quiet confirmation that I would finally get the opportunity to do the job as planned. I told Gennady in the gym. He smiled, shook my hand, and said, "Good. Don't come back too early this time." The launch was clean. No smoke, no fire, no delays. We reached Mir on schedule and docked without issue. The first time I stepped into the station, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, not emotion, but relief. I was finally where I had trained to be. I floated through the modules, noting every panel, every cable, every scent. The metal smelled different than Soyuz, drier, cleaner. The atmosphere was thinner, and the station's hum was constant. I slept lightly for the first week, waking up often, not out of discomfort but out of disbelief that I was finally in orbit for real. During one of the quiet early mornings, as the station passed over the dark curve of the Pacific, I floated by the window and stared out. Not thinking, not analyzing, just observing. That was the moment I realized the pressure I had carried for 4 years had finally lifted. We spent nearly a year in space. I worked harder than I ever had before, experiments, maintenance, EVAs, communications, systems testing. Every task, no matter how routine, felt necessary. I kept detailed notes, triple-checked every system handover. I didn't want any part of the mission to be remembered for failure. When we returned to Earth in December 1988, I felt complete. Not accomplished, not heroic, just whole. The aborted launch, the year of waiting, the failed docking attempt, all of it made sense now. Not as a path to glory, but as preparation. The real victory had been surviving long enough to try again. Years later, when the T-10-1 escape sequence was finally declassified, people started asking about it. Some called it heroic. Others wanted to know what it felt like. I answered their questions, but I never played it up. I told them it was violent, and fast, and frightening, but that the real story wasn't the launch tower or the explosion. It was what came after, the long wait, the loss of momentum, the quiet doubt. That was the part no one ever put in the official record. Gennady eventually flew again, too. In 1995, more than a decade after our abort, we ended up together one last time on Mir. Older, more worn, but still capable. We didn't say much about the past. We didn't have to. The mission went well, and we returned safely. When people ask what I learned from it all, I usually say something simple, that survival isn't the same as success, and returning to flight isn't about being fearless. It's about being ready, even when everything tells you to quit. I didn't become a cosmonaut to survive a launch abort. I became one to fly. And in the end, I did.